I very much hope you're enjoying this rapid journey through the history of everything. And I hope also that you're beginning to see some of the many intriguing connections there are between knowledge that's accumulated within different disciplines, from cosmology to chemistry and geology. And I hope you're beginning to see that when you put them together, it's only when you put them together in a single story that you can begin to see these connections. So I hope you're beginning to get a feeling for what I described in an earlier lecture as the underlying unity of modern, scientific, evidence-based accounts of the past. But it's been a very fast journey. We've covered the best part of 13 billion years in the lectures so far. So at this point, I'd like to pause briefly, take a breath, and check where we are. Most of the universe, and when I say most, I mean overwhelmingly most of the universe, is still extremely simple. It consists of cold, empty vacuum. But in tiny pockets, it's getting really interesting, and those pockets appeared quite early in the history of the universe with the appearance of stars. We've seen that complexity builds on complexity. Stars themselves created the preconditions for new forms of complexity in their hinterland, in the area around them, the area that was warmed by their energy. And so we saw that new forms of complexity began to appear in their hinterland, with the creation of planets in particular. And we've seen how we can explain each of these steps towards increasing complexity, from the universe to stars to chemical elements and now to planets. But I'm sure you'll agree that something pretty fundamental is still missing. And that thing, of course, is life. Most of the universe, as I've described it so far, is still technically dead. It's not alive. It can do lots of interesting things, we've seen, but it's not, strictly speaking, alive. Not alive in the sense that you and I are alive. So what we start doing now in the course is exploring the fifth threshold of complexity, and that threshold is creation of life. Here, perhaps more than with any of the other thresholds, we can feel the apparently magical nature of new emergent properties. Remember Nagasena's explanation of the self as an emergent property of various components assembled in certain ways. You assemble them in a certain way and suddenly, poof, something brand new, something quite magical. In this case, the sense of self appears. And something like that seems to happen with life. So, let's cross that threshold into life. Now, I'm going to do it slightly backwards. I'm going to discuss what life is and how it changes before we actually come to the question of its origins. And I hope you'll see there are very good reasons for doing it this way. Okay, let's begin with, again, one of these great cocktail party questions, which is, what is life? What is life? Life is one of those things that seems extremely obvious until you try to sit down and define it rigorously. As soon as you try to define it rigorously or scientifically, it starts wriggling and threatens to get away from you. It proves surprisingly tricky. Traditional answers to this question have often seen life as a sort of divine gift. Now, this is something we've seen over and over again by now. Trying to explain fundamental aspects of our reality, you resort to the idea of a deity of some kind. So life, too, has often been explained as a divine gift. But as we've seen, this leads us back to the familiar infinite regress of who made the creator and to the other problem of evidence for the creator. It's proved impossible to demonstrate the existence of a creator. It's even proved impossible to demonstrate the existence of a sort of generalized life force. So what modern science does is to assume that living organisms are made from the same materials and forces as non-living entities. This, incidentally, is rather like what Newton did when he showed that the heavenly realm and the earthly realm can be explained using the same laws. In other words, there wasn't an impassable gulf between them. Something like this happened in chemistry in the early 19th century. And The proof that different realms of chemistry were linked came from the work of a German chemist, Friedrich Wöhler, whose dates are 1800 to 1882. Before Wöhler's time, chemists widely believed that there were two fundamental types of chemicals. There were organic chemicals, which were the sort of stuff that created life, and there were inorganic chemicals, which created non-living things. And it was widely assumed that organic chemicals might contain some sort of special ingredient that explained life. That was the situation before Wöhler. What Wöhler did was to synthesize in a lab one of the chemical ingredients of life, an organic chemical. It happened to be urea. It doesn't matter. It's been done, the experiment has been repeated many, many times. It's now known that many of the basic chemicals of life can be synthesized. And what this proved was that the chemistry of living things is essentially the same as that of non-living things. There is, in other words, a continuum between life and non-life. And that may be why we find it so hard to distinguish scientifically between life and non-life. So there's a continuum between the two. These are not utterly different realms with some sort of huge chasm between them. Nevertheless, having said that, living organisms are different. And I'm going to use the idea of emergence to explain that difference once again. Here are some of the crucial differences, I think. First, living organisms count as a higher level of complexity. Now, there are several reasons for saying this, but first, let me remind you of the four features I've focused on as keys to understanding complexity. First, a special arrangement of elements in a new form. Secondly, some stability. So we have structure, a degree of stability. Third, the appearance with these structures of new emergent properties of some kind. And fourth, significant energy flows that sustain these complex structures. So living things are complex. Their existence depends on very specific ways of organizing matter, that structure. Get the plan wrong, and the organism simply dies. The structure's crucial. They have a degree of stability, but eventually they die. They're not eternal. They display new emergent properties, and they depend on flows of energy to maintain their complexity. You and I need to breathe, and we need to eat in order to survive. Indeed, Eric Chasson has suggested, as we've seen, that these flows are denser than in other complex things that we've looked at. And this justifies, in his mind, the argument that living things represent a higher level of complexity. Let me remind you of the figures Eric Chasson comes up with in his back-of-the-envelope calculations. He suggests that while about 2 ergs per second per gram of energy flow through a star, some 75 flow through planetary surfaces, and about 900 through simple plants, simple living organisms. And that's a sort of first suggestion that we really are dealing with a higher level of complexity. We shouldn't rely on these rough calculations too much, but they're very suggestive and they fit in well with our intuitive sense that living things are more complex than dead things. The complex structures of living things are designed exquisitely to maintain and handle these dense energy flows, and the energy flows in turn help living organisms maintain a high level of complexity. So complexity builds on energy flows, which builds complexity. Now, I said one of the properties of complex things is emergent properties. What are the emergent properties that make living organisms so different? This may be one way into defining what we mean by life. I'm going to suggest here, I have to say immediately, there's no perfect consensus on this. So any conclusions we reach are going to be slightly arbitrary. Nevertheless, I think what I argue here represents a broad consensus. 3 distinctive emergent properties distinguish living organisms from non-life and contribute to the complexity of living organisms. Some of these properties you can find to some degree in non-living things. It's really the combination of the 3, I'll argue, that is most powerful. These properties are, first, metabolism. That is, the ability to generate and use energy flows. Secondly, reproduction. The ability to make multiple copies of an organism. And third, adaptation. The ability over time to slowly change in ways that enable you to fit your environment better and better. So here are the three qualities: metabolism, reproduction, and adaptation. Let me talk about each of them in slightly more detail. First, metabolism. Metabolism means the ability to use and process energy from the environment. All living things, like all complex things, require a flow of energy to maintain themselves. And their metabolism consists of multiple chemical reactions through which they extract energy from their surroundings. Humans extract energy by eating and breathing. Plants extract energy directly from sunlight through the very complex chemical reaction known as photosynthesis. Now, in a sense, of course, both stars and planets also depend on energy flows. The difference is the astonishing variety of ways in which living organisms extract energy from their environments. Each species seems to have its own subtly different way of extracting energy from its own particular niche in the environment, its own particular place in the environment. So that's metabolism, the ability to extract energy from the environment, and we've seen it takes a huge variety of forms in living organisms. The second emergent property is reproduction. Reproduction is the ability of living organisms to make multiple copies of themselves. Now, you might say that in a sense crystals reproduce. Yes, to some degree. But they reproduce so mechanically that their copying goes nowhere. Reproduction is vital in organisms because it helps preserve new ways of extracting energy and resources. And to do that, as we'll see, the reproduction has to be not mechanical, it has to be subtler than that. It has to be slightly more flexible than that. So that's the second quality, reproduction. The third is adaptation. By adaptation, I mean the ability that living species show to change over time so as to find new ways of extracting energy from their environment. It's as if living organisms are constantly exploring their environment and looking for new ways of relating to it. Adaptation can occur both at the level of the species and the level of the individual. Individuals adapt in the sense that they learn. You and I adapt to our environments. But for understanding the longer history of biological species, it's adaptation at the level of the species that's crucial. And here what goes on is that the average features of an entire population of an organism slowly change, not the individuals. For species change, it's average change in the qualities of the species that's crucial. Now, what's remarkable is that adaptation allows organisms to keep extracting energy from their environments even if their environments change. So adaptation is wonderful if you happen to be in a somewhat unstable environment. And that, of course, is true of all living organisms. So adaptation is the ability, and it's really unique to living organisms, to slowly change over time in ways that enable you to fit better into your surroundings. Adaptation, in other words, is the key to the ability of living organisms to explore their environments and find new ways of extracting the energy they need. And that means adaptation explains why living organisms exist in such a huge diversity of forms. Okay, metabolism, reproduction, adaptation. Do these three emergent properties provide a rigorous definition of life? Probably not quite. Viruses are a sort of counterexample. They sit right at the borderline between life and non-life. Let me explain what I mean. Viruses are really little more than bundles of genetic material with no metabolism of their own. The genetic material tells them how to reproduce so they can reproduce, but they have no metabolism. What they can do, though, is hijack the metabolism of other organisms in order to reproduce. They can batten on to other organisms and extract energy from them. Next time you get a flu, you'll know that this is exactly what's happening. Viruses are doing their things. They're doing their thing. They're using your metabolism in order to survive and reproduce. And because they can reproduce, they can also adapt. So they do two of these things very well, and they can get around the absence of a metabolism. And it's because viruses can adapt that a virus such as the AIDS virus can survive even in the extremely hostile environment that humans create for them by designing antiviral drugs. So viruses test the rigidity of our definition. Nevertheless, I think it'll take us a long way. It'll cover most cases in which we're trying to distinguish between living and non-living things. Now what I want to do is to focus on one of life's most striking features. Let's call it life's astonishing creativity, its flexibility and adaptability. Its ability to keep changing, making tiny changes in response to a changing environment. It's this quality, this third property, adaptation, that allows life itself to flourish and also to create new and potentially more complex forms. Life is creative in a sense that non-living things are not. But how and why? How does adaptation work? This, we'll see, is one of the most fundamental questions of modern biology. And the answer comes from the way that the three emergent properties work together. Now, here what I'm going to do is summarize the answer in very general forms. Later, I'm going to come back and describe it much more carefully. So, at the moment, let's simply ask why and how does this process of adaptation, the creativity of life, tend to generate new levels of complexity? Because this itself is characteristic of life. Over time, life emerges, it becomes so varied that it emerges in more and more complex forms. Now, the key is the way that metabolism, reproduction, and adaptation work together. Metabolism supplies the energy needed to maintain their complex structures. Reproduction makes it possible to copy these structures, particularly if they work. So if you get a good metabolism, you can copy it through reproduction. And adaptation enables living organisms to keep tweaking their structures so as to explore new ways of extracting energy from the environment. So through adaptation, we've seen living organisms effectively explore their environment in a way that dead organisms don't do. But how does this lead to greater complexity? Why should life generate new levels of complexity all the time? Now, the first crucial thing to say here is that there seems to be no intrinsic drive to greater complexity. This contradicts what some 19th century biologists assumed. There's no intrinsic drive to greater complexity, no particular reason why life should prefer complexity to simplicity. Indeed, many species have evolved in the direction of greater simplicity, from mole rats, which have lost their eyes, they've gone blind because they live under the ground and don't need them, to snakes, which have lost their legs, it turns out they don't need them, and to viruses, which we've seen have dispensed even with having a metabolism. So evolution can take you towards greater simplicity. Nevertheless, over time, the upper level of complexity is increased. Why? Well, this, I think, is the reason, and it's fundamentally statistical. If you have a large number of species, and they're all sort of exploring their environment by adaptation, they're all tweaking the way they relate to the environment, some of these experiments that go on are bound to be more complex than others, for purely statistical reasons. Now, this itself may be why the upper level of complexity has slowly increased. Of course, more complex organisms will need more energy, so they'll have to develop a more powerful metabolism. For example, the first organisms that learned to extract energy from oxygen about 2.5 billion years ago suddenly had access to new forms of chemical energy not available to other life forms. This was a bit like striking oil for those organisms. So, we expect that over time, at least some of these species are going to be more complex. And that may be the crucial reason why, over time, living organisms have indeed become more complex. So adaptation's the key. To explain how more complex life forms have appeared over almost 4 billion years, and that, of course, is something we need to explain in order to explain ourselves. We must explain exactly how adaptation works. Now, explaining adaptation proved surprisingly difficult. In fact, this was probably the greatest challenge of 19th century biology. And we'll see in the next lecture that its solution was one of the great scientific triumphs of the modern era. I think many scientists would be inclined to say that this was really one of the 2 or 3 greatest of all scientific discoveries. But before we get to that, let's once again go back to traditional answers to explaining adaptation. Probably the most common traditional answer to the question about adaptation was, as strange as it may seem today, that living organisms don't change. There is no adaptation. Living organisms appear adapted to their environments. They fit into their environments well because that was how a benevolent creator made them. This explanation is present in the sacred texts of the Judeo-Christian Muslim tradition. You can also find it in the work of Carl Linnaeus, the founder of modern taxonomy, the system by which living organisms are classified. Let me talk briefly about Linnaeus. We'll come back to him later on. Before Linnaeus, classifying living organisms was in a state of complete chaos. Think about the problem. I mean, think if you were to sit down and try to come up with a neat way of describing all the living organisms around you. You don't need to think long to realize what a complex problem that was. What Linnaeus did was to introduce a system that was simple enough that it's still in use today. Every living organism can be described with a simple 2-word description, such as Homo sapiens, the description for our own species. In a sense, Linnaeus did for biology what Mendeleev did for chemistry and Hertzsprung and Russell for stars. They found a way of classifying or arranging a huge amount of data that turned out to be extremely illuminating. So even Linnaeus accepted that species were fixed. In other words, what he meant was there are clearly borders, there are strict borders between them. He knew that there was a bit of wriggle room in species, but basically species were fixed. However, even in Linnaeus's time, many biologists had very good reasons for thinking that living organisms were actually a lot more flexible than that, and perhaps the borders between them were illusory. Here are some of the reasons for thinking this. By the 18th century, many fossils had been found of creatures that no longer existed, such as trilobites or dinosaurs. We have drawings of these from the 17th century. And this raised the question for those who believed that God had created species as they were today. Why should God have destroyed his own creations? If God was a benevolent designer and a perfect designer, presumably God should have been able to create perfect organisms. Now, there was a sort of way around this, Noah's flood. Perhaps God had actually got so irritated with some of his organisms that he decided to wipe them out. It's perfectly possible, but it's not entirely satisfactory, as it seems to imply that the first creations were not that perfect. So there was a way around the finding of fossils, but it was not ideal. But there's another reason for thinking that species were a bit more flexible than was normally assumed. And this was that animal breeders knew perfectly well that animals do change. And in fact, there's a lot of wriggle room for changing them. Indeed, what animal breeders do is to deliberately change species, and they can do it. Darwin's Origin of the Species spends a lot of time talking about breeding. He was fascinated by the amount of flexibility that breeders could find in different species. He quotes a famous breeder of pigeons, Sir John Selbright, who used to boast that you could more or less order the sort of pigeon you want. And he used to say he would produce any given feather in 3 years. So if you say, I'd like a feather that's this shape and this colour, he could do it in 3 years. But, he said, it would take him 6 years to obtain head and beak. In other words, if you want a particular type of head and beak, it might take him 6 years to do it. We're talking, of course, about designer pigeons. But the point is that pigeons turned out to be very flexible. You can look at pictures of 19th century pigeon breeders' products and you see huge variety. Look today at dogs. They're very closely related, but look at the amount of variety that exists within what we normally think of as a single species. So by the 19th century, there was growing evidence that species really are very flexible, they really do change, and maybe the borders between them were permeable. But how do you explain that? How do species change? And why, when they change, are the changes adaptive? Why do those changes enable them to fit well into their environments? Well, one of the most serious 19th century attempts to explain adaptation is associated with the work of the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. In 1809, we're in the time of the Napoleonic Empire. Lamarck proposed that species change in effect because they want to. The famous example he gave is that of giraffes. So you imagine an environment, a savanna environment, where you have a sort of horse-like animal with a longish neck. And maybe the tasty leaves are quite high up. So this animal has an advantage. It can get to the leaves on top of shrubs and trees. And what Lamarck did was to imagine that this creature over time stretches its neck higher and higher. And he argued that over time, over many generations, you're going to find the necks are slowly going to get longer. And eventually they might even turn into giraffes. What's wrong with this? I suspect that most of you can pick straight away what the problem is with this argument. And the trouble is that any animal breeder could have pointed out to Lamarck what was wrong with this argument. And this is what it is. Qualities acquired during one's lifetime are acquired characteristics. They are not passed on to one's offspring. Imagine, ghastly thought, but imagine that I were to spend a lot of time in the gym and develop a body like my governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now, imagine also, God forbid, that I were to have some more kids. Would they all be born with bodies like Arnie Schwarzenegger? And the answer, of course, is no, thank God. And the reason is because acquired characteristics, characteristics you acquire during your lifetime, are not passed on to your children. What you pass on are inherited characteristics, characteristics that you received from earlier generations. A fattened pig, a pig that you have fed a lot of food to so as to make it fat, will not necessarily produce fat piglets. But a pig that had very fat parents may produce fat piglets. So Lamarck's theory didn't work. Now we've seen that life represents a new level of complexity based on control of energy, the capacity to reproduce, and the ability to change, to adapt to changing environments. We've also seen that in the middle of the 19th century, the riddle of adaptation, this task of explaining how do living organisms adapt. Why is life so creative? This was the key to understanding what made life different from non-life. It remained unsolved, this riddle. Charles Darwin would solve the riddle in a book that he published in 1859. Thank you. Within different disciplines, from cosmology to chemistry and geology. And I hope you're beginning to see that when you put them together, it's only when you put them together in a single story that you can begin to see these connections. So I hope you're beginning to get a feeling for what I described in an earlier lecture as the underlying unity of modern, scientific, evidence-based accounts of the past. But it's been a very fast journey. we've covered the best part of 13 billion years in the lectures so far. So at this point, I'd like to, most of the universe as I've described it so far is still technically dead. It's not alive. It can do lots of interesting things, we've seen, but it's not, strictly speaking, alive. Not alive in the sense that you and I are alive. So what we start doing now in the course is exploring the fifth threshold of complexity. And that threshold is creation of life. Here, perhaps more than with any of the other thresholds, we can, in the area around them, the area that was warmed by their energy. And so we saw that new forms of complexity began to appear in their hinterland, with the creation of planets in particular. And we've seen how we can explain each of these steps towards increasing complexity, from the universe to stars to chemical elements and now to planets. But I'm sure you'll agree that something pretty fundamental is still missing. And that thing, of course, is life. I very much hope you're enjoying this rapid journey through the history of everything. And I hope also that you're beginning to see some of the many intriguing connections there are between knowledge that's accumulated. Pause briefly, take a breath, and check where we are. Most of the universe, and when I say most, I mean overwhelmingly most of the universe, is still extremely simple. It consists of cold, empty vacuum. But in tiny pockets, it's getting really interesting. And those pockets appeared quite early in the history of the universe with the appearance of stars. We've seen that complexity builds on complexity. Stars themselves created the preconditions for new forms of complexity in their hinterland.